title. Um, and I would like to sort of take this opportunity to introduce Manjari, who's a very good friend as well. But interestingly, this is the first time I've gotten this opportunity to introduce Manjari. And while going through what I wanted to say, I realized that we both joined ICERS at almost at the same, roughly the same time in 2013. Manjari is a biologist with a very sort of broad interest in ecology and evolution, and she specializes in acoustic communication in animals and in behavioral biology. She was trained at Center for Ecological Sciences, and Professor Gadekar is also here, who was the head of the department at that time, and Center for Ecological Sciences. So Manjari uses a very interesting combination of everything to get to her questions. So she uses both field methods, lab-based methods. She's also doing molecular biology now, computational simulations, you name it. So I think the pretty much her approach is also what quite a few of us use. That is, the question is more important, and the means to get to that is something that we pick up on our way. Having said that, she has a extremely vast experience in this communications and acoustic communications, which we're going to hear today. So after her PhD at CES, Manjari went to University of Zurich and as well as University of Bristol for 2 postdocs, where also she continued working on acoustic systems in crickets. And you may probably see when she gives the talk that acoustics is a very large field, and sound is something that we're still learning a lot about. And so she has by now looked at acoustics in fishes, birds, mammals, and insects. So with this, I welcome Manjari, and I would also like to add that, of course, I'm a very big fan of Manjari, being a woman fellow scientist and an ICER sort of sister institution. But besides myself, my daughter, who's a 7.5-year-old, is a big fan of Manjari, and so is her daughter, who's a 6-year-old. So it's really nice to see women scientists manage to, or be trying to balance both family and everything else. And I hope students who are here, both males and females, sort of take an inspiration from this, that sometimes we can manage to get almost all, and make it look okay. So with this, I welcome Manjari. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, Vanita. It was such a wonderful way to introduce, especially the part that you spoke about how one has to, scientists are humans, which is what we must constantly remind ourselves and others. So I'll just share my slides. The talk that I have prepared is fairly non-technical and should interest a broad audience. Vanita, can you see my slides? Okay. So like Vanita said, my primary interest lies in acoustic communication in animals, in which I have asked various kinds of questions, and the various questions have, to address the various questions, I have used various model systems. And some of the model systems offer to answer certain questions in a more comprehensive way than others, and therefore some become more important in your lab than others, which does not glorify or reduce the value of any other model system. It is just depending upon what kind of questions you have. So with that, I would like to introduce you to some model systems that I work on. I work on both diurnal and nocturnal species. This is a purple sunbird. My students have been working on the acoustic communication in purple sunbird and also looking at their behavior. This is Nicobarese long-tailed macaque, which a master student of mine was working with and is continuing to work with Professor Meva Singh, again looking at it from the acoustics perspective and also their behavior. I have also worked on bats, both fruit bats and insectivorous bats. I have worked on moths and I have worked on crickets. I haven't worked on frogs, I haven't worked on grasshoppers, but there are several other birds that I have worked on now more recently. The main focus of my lab is on the social babblers. And I will talk about all of, we know a little bit about the purple sunbirds vocalization and the babblers, babbling in babblers through my talk. But I'll also introduce you to a little bit of what I did with crickets, because that is how my career really sort of started. This is I would like to sort of touch upon that a bit. Before I address specific questions, I want to introduce to all of you, many of you may be students of behavior, that there can be in animal behavior, there are two broad categories of questions, which we call as proximate questions, which deal with mechanism or development of a behavior, what causes a certain behavior, what environmental stimulus sort of triggers a behavior, what is the mechanism which could be the neural or the endocrinological processes that underlie behavior. And then there are ultimate questions which deal with what is the function of a certain behavior and how it may have evolved, so on and so forth. So these are Tinbergen's 4 questions. And some of the questions which I have been interested in are listed here. For instance, what are the drivers of signal structure evolution? So signal structure, when I say signal, I basically mean acoustic signals, because that is what my primary interest is in. So what drives signal structure evolution? There can be many different factors that drive what signals finally look like, so how they are structured. And so I'm interested in those selective forces or the drivers of signal structure. Also, I've been interested in how animals perceive and produce sound, and I have worked on this a little bit using the invertebrate model system crickets. But I no longer work on this as much as I work on some other questions that I've listed below. For instance, how do animals communicate in noisy choruses? So how do they deal with noise of other species and their own kind? So when many are communicating together, how do they manage to effectively pass on the information and receive the information and act accordingly? And why do animals have very large repertoire of calls? And not all, but some. Also, what kind of information all of these calls convey? How is this information encoded in the signal? And whether there are some rules that underlie how these signals are going to be structured and how information will be encoded. So these are some broad category of questions that my students and I have been working on. I'll start with the drivers of signal structure evolution. And there can be several drivers that shape signals and determine how signals will be. The most important, of course, as we know, is natural selection, which include pressure from predators as well as parasites. I'm talking about acoustic signals. What determines what kind of acoustic signals an animal produces, and also its signaling behavior. So natural selection is one, but of course also sexual selection. And I'm assuming that most of you here know what natural and sexual selection is. And for those who don't know, I will just very quickly say that natural selection deals specifically with survival and reproduction of an animal, traits that enhance the chance of survival and reproduction or reproduction of animals. And what is natural about it and why it is selection, this is an entire thing which we can go on for a very long time. But basically, one thing that I will say, if the animals do not survive to reproduce, then there is no if they do not survive to reproduce, then there is no fitness anyway for the animal. We are talking about Darwinian fitness. But on the other hand, if they survive but do not reproduce, then also we say that the Darwinian fitness is sort of not realized. Sexual selection, on the other hand, exclusively focuses on reproduction, and it focuses on how within species competition between, say, males and female choice can drive the evolution of certain traits, and this includes evolution of acoustic signal structure. Okay, so these are two major, but apart from that, there are other drivers of signal structure evolution, including habitat structure, masking interference. Masking habitat structure is basically the physical habitat of the animal. The animals live in a non-ideal habitat. They don't live in acoustic chambers. We do many experiments in acoustic chambers, but we must remember that the animals must communicate in noisy conditions, and this noisy condition can be from animals that are calling around it, or it could be abiotic noise of the habitat itself, plus the structure of the habitat, the leaves, the branches, the trees. They are all going to they are all going to be obstacles to signal transmission. So in that sense, habitat structure, masking interference, these are also important drivers of signal evolution. So signals must evolve to effectively transmit through a cluttered habitat. And we also expect that signals must have evolved to effectively to have effective communication between signalers and receivers, dealing with masking, dealing with the noise that is present around them. So last but not the least, of course, I'm interested in how sociality influences the evolution of acoustic communication, and also the impact and the influence of acoustic communication on sociality with respect to how acoustic communication mediates social relationships. So these are my broad areas of interest, and I'll start with the crickets. So you will hear crickets everywhere. It is 7:30 now. You should be able to hear crickets if you are sitting somewhere outdoors or near your window or a balcony. You should be able to hear crickets. Crickets are nocturnal insects in which males produce sound by rubbing their raised forewings together. You can see a male has raised its forewings and it rubs its wings together to produce sound. And the wing of the male has this specialized sound producing structures. Here the harp and a mirror is shown, which basically is lacking in the female. This is the wing of a female, and you can see that these structures are lacking in the female. So this basically means that the females are silent. And the production of sound in crickets is not unlike how one plays the guitar, where there's a structure called a plectrum. Here is the plectrum, the hardened edge of a wing that rubs against a row of teeth that you can see under the wing. So under the wing, there are a row of teeth and the wings rub against each other. Plectrum sort of moves against these row of teeth to produce one pulse of sound. Okay, and then several pulses get together, and then the temporal structure of the call is sort of generated. And different parts of the wing also amplify certain frequencies and dampen other frequencies to give rise to the spectral characteristics of the cricket's call. Okay, so then we have temporal structure of the call, which basically shows us how energy is distributed against time, and spectral features, which is what is the peak frequency, the pitch of the call, if you like, but it's not quite the pitch, but similar to the pitch. So which tells how energy is distributed across different frequencies. So this is how the cricket produces sound. And what does it do with it? So basically the male crickets produce sound to attract females, and they do so in complete darkness. And the females must now listen to the calls of the male of the same species, be able to detect it, recognize it, and localize. So there are 3 steps, and it should be able to do all 3. It should be able to detect the call in this noise. It should be able to detect the call even when it has degraded through the habitat. Second, it should be able to recognize once the calls get degraded, and I will show you some examples of degraded calls. It should be able to recognize this call as its own species call, and finally use this call, information in this call, to finally find this male in complete darkness. So this is what the female has to achieve, even though she doesn't sing. So she does exercise choice. So first thing that I will talk about very briefly, and each of these sections I'll touch upon very briefly, as habitat as a driver of signal structure evolution. For this, I'll take you to the Western Ghats, where I did much of my field work for my PhD work. This is rainforests of Kudremukh National Park. And if you look at the forest inside, it is very heterogeneous. The structure is, it's at different layers of the forest have different foliage density. There are many different species of plants. Their microhabitat structure is very diverse. So the structurally, the rainforest is very heterogeneous, which also means that different parts of the rainforest should degrade the signals differently. Okay, so I hope this part is clear. If the structure of the habitat is uniform, then it does not matter where the animal calls from, because the signal would transmit equally bad or equally good in every different part of the forest. But that is not the case in case of rainforest, and I know that because I measured it. So I examined whether how sort of the signal transmits to this forest, and when it reaches the position of receivers, what does it sort of look like or sound like. Okay, so before I go into explaining to you why how I did these things, and I want to introduce you to this hypothesis, which is known as the acoustic adaptation hypothesis, proposed by Morton in 1975. It basically suggests that the habitat structure imposes selective pressure on the signal transmission, and therefore must drive the evolution of signals. And therefore it predicts that the prediction of the hypothesis is that signals must transmit better through native habitats than they would through non-native habitats. This would mean that given a particular signal, its transmission would be better in native locations as versus non-native locations. Okay. Now, this could also mean that the signals, given the signal that an animal has, it either chooses a location where the transmission is maximized, okay, or the signal has evolved to transmit best in that native location. Okay, either which way, the way to test it is to see whether signals of species that call from specific location is best transmitted in that native location. Okay, that is how you test the acoustic adaptation hypothesis, and I went about doing this with the crickets of Kudremukh. There were many species of crickets in Kudremukh, and I selected 12 to represent the signal diversity. They have all different kinds of calls. But I will not play those calls for you for a limitation on time. But there were crickets that called from the ground. There were crickets that called from the lower understory, mid understory, upper understory, and canopy. And the question I asked was, does the call of a species transmit best from the, in this case, microhabitat, because these are crickets, so that is a biologically relevant scale for them, from the microhabitat that it actually calls from. Okay, and to do this, of course, one has to carry out a lot of transmission experiments, which would also mean that I had to carry a lot of equipment, 2 laptops, batteries to power the speakers, amplifiers, insane amount of wires, and you name it. I mean, all the equipment that was there in my PhD supervisor's lab practically would be hoarded by me. And those 6 months of dry season where there is no rain in Kudremukh, and which is also when the crickets are most active, I would be in the forest with all these equipment basically running all these transmission experiments. So we play back the calls from different heights. For the same species, we play back the call from different heights, and we re-record at different heights also. So a full factorial design. Okay. And so you can then ask that, do the signal transmit best in the native habitats? You could also, if there is support for acoustic adaptation, it could also imply that the vertical stratification that we see could actually be driven by selective pressure to transmit efficiently in these different layers of the forest. Okay, so these were the questions we asked, and I had to do a lot of gymnastics, a lot of circus. I'm putting in all of these things. This is an old story, but I want to put this in just for the younger students and also PhD students who are here, to sort of understand that every PhD is different. Every PhD is going to be a story of a lot of difficulties, ups and downs, a lot of battle. And there are going to be times when things don't work your way, but you just have to, persistence is one of the things. And the other thing is, of course, please seek help. So here I collaborated with Greenpeace activists who were also canopy climbers, who taught me how to climb trees, but not quite climb trees, but basically we use ascenders to just go up the trees. It was easier than climbing trees. And here is my field assistant Sudhakar. I hope you can see this, and you can see if you look at his face, you can see he's completely shocked to see me going up the tree with so little effort, and given that I was certainly not as physically fit as he was. And he used to climb trees for us. But of course, when I had to do the transmission experiments from the canopy, it was not possible for Sudhakar to climb up to the canopy of trees. And so we collaborated with Greenpeace activists so that we could reach the canopy of the forest. And here there is Xavier, and then there's Gaurav, who helped me with the transmission experiments. We set up a monkey crawl line in the middle of the rainforest canopy. So this is the top of this tree, and this tree I had shown you earlier in this picture. This is where Gaurav and I would sit, and we had drawn a monkey crawl line here. Okay, so this is the kind of sort of gymnastics we did, but it became easier when we collaborated. If I had wanted to do this on my own, it would have had been infinitely difficult. So collaboration is good, it's not bad, okay, especially when your skills are complementary. So then we did all of these gymnastics and circus, and what do we find? Basically, long story cut short, the signals, as you can see, this is the signal that degrades, okay, at different heights. At 2 meters it degrades less, but on the ground the signal degrades much worse. And the story was consistent irrespective of the signal type, irrespective of which species calls from where. Basically, it meant that some parts of the forest were much worse than some other parts of the forest. So then one would expect that animals would avoid those parts of the forest, but that was not true. And I examined acoustic adaptation using multiple proxies of signal degradation, which also meant that I had to learn a lot of signal analysis, something that with my zoology background, certainly I did not know, but it is again a skill that you pick up during your research. And I again collaborated with signal processing engineers who tried to help, and even they failed at times. So this is just the process of science. And eventually we managed to get there, and I managed to write my codes to analyze the envelopes of the signals to see how they degrade. And this is just to show the story was consistent. On the ground, the signals degraded very severely, although it was across species, the severity of degradation was different, but within a species across all different heights, the ground was the worst. The canopy was not so bad. In fact, the triangle here you see is the canopy. The canopy was not so bad. Okay, it was quite the opposite of what I had expected. Anyway, so I will not go to the great details of how exactly we did this and what were the main results, but I'll tell you the take-home message. Of the 12 species that I tested using 3 different measures of signal degradation, something which no one had done for any species till then, everyone used to use just one, typically attenuation as a measure for signal degradation. I used 3 different. And when you look at many different measures and you ask the question and use many different parameters to assess, then you get sort of the complete picture. And what I found was the acoustic adaptation hypothesis. We did not have support for the acoustic adaptation hypothesis. Of the 12 species that I tested acoustic adaptation hypothesis, and only one upheld it by all 3 measures. Okay, but by specific measures, for instance, by attenuation, there were a set of species that upheld AH. But if you look at all 3 measures of signal degradation, which is the right thing to do, because all 3 are important for detection, recognition, and localization of the signal. When we take all 3, only 1 out of 12 uphold the hypothesis. So this basically meant that probably driver of vertical stratification certainly is not habitat, and probably it is not exerting enough selective pressure for the animals to move away from certain very bad microhabitat types. Okay. The second thing that I tested with crickets, and again looking at evolution of signal structure, this was my post-PhD work. I continued to work with my PhD advisor, Rohini Balakrishnan. She was interested in understanding what is going on and how animals are communicating in so much noise. And I was interested in it from the signal evolution perspective, that, have the signals evolved to deal with noise. And so the question really is basically comes under the cocktail party problem, wherein you have multiple sources of sound that sort of overlap in time and frequency. And basically what you get is something like this. This is species one that is calling. You have another species that is calling. You have a third species you have called, they are calling blah, blah. And you have many. So in Kudremukh, we had many different species, about 20 species, of which a set of them were active at the same time of the year. So we asked whether signals are sort of structured so that they avoid masking from each other, from other species. Okay, so heterospecific masking. Signals of species are structured in a way, or have evolved to avoid masking, heterospecific masking in this community. And if that were true, then they would be able to effectively communicate even when all the species and different individuals were calling. So the problem really is everyone is calling together. And in fact, if you walk into Kudremukh, it is a complete cacophony for us, but whether it's a cacophony for the crickets or not is really roughly, in a very colloquial way, we were asking. So how do they manage there's a very high acoustic diversity in Kudremukh, and we asked how do they coexist? How do they share this acoustic space? Okay. So again, I will not go into the methodological details, but I again had to do a lot of signal transmission experiments. We measured the calls of the crickets. We looked at how loud these calls were. We analyzed the calls to see what is the frequency of the call, what is the temporal structure of the call, whether the calls of another species fall into the silent gaps of a species with which it calls. Okay, so we were asking all of these questions, measured all of these parameters, put them together into a simulation to simulate a virtual forest. Okay, so you have here Mycopoda, that is calling, one species which is calling, which is a very loud species and has a very broad transmission range. And you can see that other species, the sound sphere of other species are getting subsumed in it. And this is exactly how these were also spatially apart from each other. I also measured where exactly in the rainforest, and it was not easy to find every single species that is calling in a patch. Every single species, all individuals, we would locate, mark, and we would ask, well, what is really going on? How far is each one from each? And we have a focal individual, and we ask for this focal species, what is the masking scenario like? Okay. So now I just want to explain to you these two graphs, and which should be able to help you understand what is going on. Here I have just looked at species pairs. How does this species get masked by this? And how does this get masked by this? You obviously understand that this is not going to be symmetrical. So this is pairwise. For two species, we ask what is the masking condition. If we assume this is a realistic scenario where each species is calling a different loudness or intensity, one is softer, one is louder. But if we assume that they are all equally loud, and if we assume that they can hear each other, and by hearing, I mean tuning. For instance, we cannot hear bats because we are not tuned to the ultrasound. But if we could hear bats, and if the bats could hear us, then what would the masking situation be like? So this is a simulated result, okay, the top one. And all are calling as loud, and all can hear all other frequencies. This is what the pairwise masking scenario would be like if that were the case. And we contrast it with the real scenario where each one is calling at different intensity, loudness, and different at different frequencies. And we also incorporate how far they were from the spatial. So this is the spatial overlap, but given how close they are to each other, if they were all equally loud, how it would be like. And with that, we incorporate the timing of the call. Do they call exactly at the same instant, or do they insert their calls in the silent intervals of the calls of other species? Okay. So we incorporate all of this information, which is the real life scenario, if you like. And this is what the masking scenario is like. Almost all species pairs, you can see they drop down, masking drops down to almost close to zero, which is silence in a cacophony. This was pairwise, and I did this for multi-species masking also, where I not just Pyrmida with Weiner, I did Pyrmida, how Pyrmida is masked by Weiner, by Londreva, by Phaloria, etc., everybody. So multi-species interactions also I looked at, and the answer was roughly the same. Given that the calls, the various call parameters that we sort of put in, the temporal structure and the spectral features of the call, the frequency that they call it, provide sufficient parameter space for partitioning of this acoustic space. So you can think of it as a radio where different callers are tuning into different frequencies, and thereby when you tune into that band, you will only, if you tune into 98.3, you're only going to hear 98.3 FM. Otherwise, you're going to tune into Radio Mirchi or whatever. Okay, so you don't, there is no masking, there is no leak there. And this is what tuning achieves. Okay, and in combination with the loudness of the call. So some species are louder than the others. So the tuning and call intensity were independent measure ways of escaping masking. We also found that there was some evidence to show that those who had very similar temporal structures avoided calling together, but to our great surprise, spacing did not have any effect on masking release, which means that it would not help to move away from a loud masker. Okay, so spacing basically had the natural spacing. One of the hypotheses I had was they are also spaced in a manner that the calls do not reach them, but that was not true. Okay, so what I want you all to understand basically is what I found as silence in the cacophony, and all of this is achieved without any higher neural or cognitive processing, which simply means that the signals are so structured, they are structured in a manner in the temporal and frequency domain that allows them to coexist in this cacophony. So therefore, why are the signals so structured? One of the answers in the cricket community in the rainforest of Kudremukh certainly is to avoid masking. It seems like masking could be an important driver of signal structure, because that really did help. Okay, so I'll change gears a little bit and go away from crickets now and come to birds. And before I talk about birds, my own work, I want to quickly introduce you to a paper that I had read when I was much younger. And this paper was about the tail of the peacock and why it is so extravagant, and does it actually convey information about the peacock. So whether the title was, is the peacock merely beautiful or also honest? And this was written by Professor Raghavendra Gadakar, who is with us today. And it was published in Current Science in 2003, I think. And it really made me interested in evolution of, again, signals. But at that time, it was about visual signals. But very quickly, I went to acoustic signals. I'll tell you that story very quickly. So basically, the gist of the the problem is that when Darwin, observed the peacock's tail, of course, it's known as Darwin's puzzle, he did not find natural selection adequate enough to explain the evolution of this wasteful, extravagant, ornamental secondary sexual character, which is the tail of the peacock. So he proposed sexual selection as the explanation, and it's very nicely written. Please, I urge all of you to read that paper. It's very nicely written and tells you the story in a much, much nicer way than you could, figure out by reading the original papers even. So he proposed sexual selection, but it still did not quite explain why the tail should be this long. Okay, a little exaggeration in the tail is what he proposed, was appealing to the females. So the females were choosy and they chose males who had an extravagant tail. The question still remains that is this female peacock, or rather peahen, is this an idiosyncratic being who is choosing the males based on beauty, or is there something more to this? And then, of course, Fisher came up with this kind of an explanation as to how this could come about, wherein he sort of said that let us assume that a slight exaggeration in a trait, a slight exaggeration, is indeed an indicator of male quality. So in that case, you would expect that females who then have a preference for males with this longer tail, slightly longer tail, are going to end up mating with males who are better in quality, and therefore they will sire sons with longer tails and daughters who will have this preference for choosing peacocks with longer tails. So there is sort of, this it has to be heritable. So sexier sons and choosier females, and then it takes away in this runaway selection path, and therefore it will become longer and longer, sort of this positive feedback loop kicks in, and it becomes longer and longer until the sort of the cost of having that long tail sort of is much higher than what the benefit. So natural selection comes into picture, okay? But still it does not explain why the females should choose long. So it's a proximate explanation, but it still does not, it still in some sense says that, the very long tail of the peacock is not quite indicator of its male quality. A slight exaggeration may be, but it does not mean that it translates to a very high measure of exaggeration. So if the tail of the peacock becomes very, very long, that does not mean it is any better than a male peacock who has a slightly longer tail, right? So it is still sort of not satisfactory from a very adaptationist point of view. Okay, so then of course comes in Amod Zahavi, who proposes the handicap principle, and which basically posits that only high quality, so this very extravagant traits are costly. They are costly in many different, they can be costly in many different ways. They could be costly to produce, they could be costly to maintain, they could be costly to bear because they are attracting also predators. So they have a cost, and only high quality signalers can afford to produce, maintain, and bear these costly signals, which is the handicap principle, okay? So from this sort of, when I started working on my own, a PhD, I was, of course, thinking about all of these things at the time, reading these papers, because I started reading these papers actually quite late. It was only during my end of my master's and my PhD when I was reading these papers. And what occurred to me was, what about extravagance in acoustic signals? Is there extravagance in acoustic signals? And so on the side, while I have been doing other things, I have also been looking at extravagance in acoustic signals, and we have looked at various species, including, and the model species that I usually choose are not so glamorous, and they are not so difficult to find. They're typically species that are found everywhere, and species on which, even despite the fact that they are found everywhere, especially in India, most people have not worked on it. In fact, almost no one has worked on it. So the first species a student of mine sort of was looking at was the common myna. Of course, it's very common, and they are also sexually monomorphic. And we started looking at their calls, which you can hear. This is Nakul, who started the work, and my PhD student Sonia, who was helping him. We recorded the calls, and we started analyzing these calls based on various acoustic parameters, which you don't have to worry about right now. You just need to know that there are some very basic units which we call as notes. Two notes may combine to form what we call a syllable when the notes are very close to each other. When the internote interval is very short, then we call this as a syllable. When many notes combine, where the internote interval is sort of significant, as you can see, there's a lot of silence between these notes, then it is called a phrase. So we started looking at the calls of the common myna, and we started analyzing how many unique note types does the myna have. And 15 minutes of recording. It doesn't mean only 15 minutes, hours of recording, but there's 15 minutes of signal in it. When we when we analyzed all of this, we kept getting new notes, 213 note types and counting. It kept increasing, it kept increasing. So you can see that we have not yet reached the asymptote, which means that there's a huge vocal repertoire, and certainly extravagant is what I would say. When we looked at the abundance of these notes, some notes were far more abundant than some others, okay? And I have just chosen a small section of the notes to just test this. And we also found that these notes combine in a limited fashion to form syllables, okay? That is a story I shall not go into too much detail, but it will suffice to know that not all notes are combining with each other. There seems to be something that is restricting the combination of these notes, okay? And this became even more evident when I looked at purple sunbird calls, which is again another extremely common backyard bird found throughout India. And my PhD student Sonam was looking at the repertoire of purple sunbird to understand syntax and various other interests that she had. What we found was, unlike the common Maina, it did not have 200 or such extravagant repertoire. It had a limited repertoire of about 23 notes. But if you think about it, these 23 notes combine to form phrases, which are like letters combining to form words. And if you have 23 letters, and if the word size can be up to say 13 letters, okay, how many different kinds of words can you make? It's a very large number, right? So if we combine these 23, again, I'll just repeat this once. If we had 23 notes, and if we could combine these 23 notes to make words which are at least 2 letters long, up to 13 letters long, which is what the phrase size of this bird was, how many different phrases do we expect? That number is a very, very large number. And so, of course, I expected some acoustic bonanza that, you'll find so many phrases. But when Sonam analyzed these calls, and later on other students, Kaustubh also has been analyzing these calls, the number of phrases are actually not that many. From Sonam's data, we know it is roughly about a little less than 30. And so we started looking at the phrases more carefully, and we asked what really is going on. What we found was there are some notes that occur only in certain positions. For instance, this note, which is called as the M note, always occurred as an introductory note or the first note. Then there was the body of the phrase, okay? And towards the end, there was a twitter, which is a very quickly where the bird produces the notes very quickly, very, very fast, which is called the suffix, okay? So the phrase had a structure. The phrase had an introductory note called the prefix, the body, and the suffix, okay? Now we ask, how common is the prefix? How common is the suffix? And what do we find? We find that the prefix actually is very common, okay? But the suffix is less so. Now here the suffix, you can see the suffix much better here. This is the prefix, the M note. This is the body of the phrase. And here you see these notes. I have expanded these notes here. You can see that these notes actually overlap with each other in time. Some of these notes are actually occurring in the same breath. So if you think about how the sound is produced, now going back to how animals produce sound, they are producing two different kinds of notes because they are two different frequencies. One is around 7 kilohertz, one is around 4 kilohertz. You can see this note, J2, F2, you see. They are two different sounds which are being produced at the same instant. This is complex vocal mechanism. And this is part of the suffix of some of the phrases of the purple sunbird. It is not very common. Less than 20% of the phrases we found had suffixes, although close to 80% of the phrases that we found had the prefix. So there is a prefix, there's a body, there's a suffix, and something is going on. The notes don't seem to be combining in all possible ways. Okay. Now, we also know that in other species where these complex notes with this overlapping feature is there, at least in canaries, we know that these syllables are known as sexy syllables because males who can produce these calls are the ones who are preferred by the females. Whether such is the case in purple sunbird or not, I need a student who will test this out. Okay. So if any of you is interested, do give me a shout. So we know that the purple sunbird is also producing these very complex notes, which is produced through a mechanism called complex vocal mechanism. We know that suffixes are rare. We know that prefixes are very common, but we do not know why make these rare and hard to produce sounds. Maybe it is hard to produce, it is costly, maybe it is an indicator of a better male, maybe at least to begin with, females seem to prefer males with these. We don't know. These questions are still unanswered and we are still working on these. The other part of the mystery where we looked at why don't all these 23 different letters combine to form these various words? And clearly that is not happening. So we asked why, what really is going on. So we looked at whether certain notes only occur in certain positions. For instance, if you have Y, the letter Y, why is it more likely to occur in the middle of a word or in the beginning of the word or towards the end of the word? That is the question, somewhat what we asked. Okay, so we're looking at positional effect within a phrase for the different note types. Okay, and if they were randomly occurring. So here, if you look at from from a scale 0 to 100, so again here this should be 0 to 100, it is incorrect. You will find that they can occur. So this is a random distribution. So you see, you can any note is equally likely almost to occur anywhere in the phrase. So this is what is the expectation, but what is the reality? What is the observation? We find that now 100% of the time, a particular note occurs in a particular location. So say for instance, note T only occurs in B6 position. If you look at note M, it only occurs in the prefix position. It doesn't occur anywhere else. Okay. So we had notes which had positional fidelity. Okay. Which basically means that there are some underlying rules which determine the phrase structure. I'm also curious, and again, this is work in progress, and an undergrad is working on it to look at whether some notes can only come before or after certain other notes. So whether there's an order effect. Okay, for instance, Q is usually followed by the letter U. Okay, so such kind of questions we asked in the Purple Sunbird, and it's a very interesting story. It's a developing story, and I'll have more to say very soon. But basically, it says that elaborate vocal repertoire does exist in these in birds. Is it really an extravagance? That is really a question one really has to deeply understand. There are various birds who make a variety of calls, which may be costly. So the question really is whether it is under sexual selection. We do not know. We do not know whether whether the females prefer males with these large repertoires, whether our extravagant repertoire of the common myna is driven by sexual selection, whether Purple Sunbird, the complex vocal mechanism in the syllables of the Purple Sunbird, is it driven by sexual selection? We do not know. We do not yet know. We understand that there are some combinatorial rules, there are some structural rules that determine phrase structure in the Purple Sunbird, but we do not know why this positional fidelity exists. There is positional fidelity. We don't understand why this exists. And we do not know why don't the notes combine in a less stringent manner. If really large repertoire is what the females would want, why not have a very large repertoire, which is clearly possible. Okay. So these are the questions which are still in progress. And with that, I would like to come to the very last part of my talk, and which is about, now I'm coming about, I have been talking about structural complexity, where you can have many different kinds of notes. You can have one note which is repeated in multiple, in different ways. This is also complexity. You can have the same number of elements, but different, the composition is different. This is all the same set. So there are 3 elements in each of these calls, but the composition is different. This is another form of structural complexity. Ordering may be different, A, B, C, C, A, B, so on and so forth. This is all forms of structural complexity. But there is something else. There is what we call as functional complexity, where there might be meaning of the call. Different calls may have distinct meaning, and these distinct meanings may be produced because of these structural rules. For instance, BAT bat versus BAN ban. These have 2 elements in common, and one element has been replaced, okay? But the meaning changes, okay? So this would be what we call as a phoneme. On the other hand, if you combine two meaningless units or even meaningful units and a new meaning is formed, that would be syntax. So we got interested in looking at phonemes and syntax in birds, non-human vocalization. Of course, it is there in human language, and this is where my jungle babblers come in, social babblers. We have been working on several species of social babblers, and the jungle babblers are the primary model system for much of this structural and functional complexity work. And this is Sonam, and this is Sonia. These two students of mine have been the foundational members of the Jungle Babbler work, who have started this work and have already unraveled so much complexity in the vocal communication of these birds. And I have just a last few slides to show you how complex these calls are and why are we so excited about it. So these are different calls. I have just shown you structurally different calls, okay? These are spectrograms and these are single note calls, okay? And each one is having a different meaning. Some are produced in the context of contacting group members. So jungle babblers, these are social birds. They live in large, small to large groups. They can have groups which are about 3 to 5 individuals or can go up to 13 individuals or so. And then we also know that jungle babblers are sexually monomorphic. You can't say whether it is Saat Bhai or Seven Sisters. We also know that they are cooperative breeders, which means that it's like an Indian joint family system where there is typically there is a single breeding pair, and the others help raise the offsprings of that breeding pair. And typically it is expected that the ones who are raise the offsprings are also related to each other. All of these calls have different meanings. And this was the work of Sonam, who deciphered using simple observations in the field, which took a very long time, a lot of hard work, but she deciphered, and with the help of some playback experiments, we could decipher the exact function of these calls. Okay, so some are to contact left behind group members. If one group member has been left behind and the group has moved from one feeding ground to another feeding ground, the group member can produce a call to contact its group, and the group members will then give the same call back, and then they exchange this call, and then one of the group members, or maybe the entire group, will come to fetch back this left behind member. So these are contact calls. They are calls that are produced specifically during foraging. They are calls that are produced by offsprings, which are not produced by adults, so on and so forth. Then there are calls which have multiple notes which have been combined. Here, this note is different. These are less. This is different from these, but these are similar to each other. Here again, you can see there are multiple notes that have been combined to form a phrase. Here again, there are harsh calls. Then there is this call which has a very different structure. So you have multi-syllable calls and you have monosyllabic calls, okay? And each of these have a different unique meaning. What do we find? We found basically that the jungle babbler has 15 different calls with distinct meaning. Out of these 15, 8 were in relation to vigilance alone. So to alert the group members of a predator, or to alert group members of a situation of distress, or in case of intergroup fights, that there is invasion by another group, so on and so forth. So and there are these sentinel calls which are produced by a babbler which is perched high up in some elevated location, and it will be producing this call, which basically we think says all is well, because the sentinel call is really soft and it is not responded to by the group members. As long as the sentinel keeps producing this call, the group continues to forage. And this is the watchman song hypothesis, which can be tested at some point. But basically the sentinel call is also there, so on and so forth. So you can see here that these different calls are sort of, there are some calls that are very different from each other, whereas in some other situations, you will find that there is possibility of note sharing. The calls, these are just DFA plots, and you can see that in some situations, the calls are distinctly different. And in this case, these are notes. These are notes of a particular call. These are harsh calls, which are composed of, say, 4 different letters. Okay, H1, H2, H3, and H4. And you can see that they are all acoustically distinct, completely distinct. In other cases, you will see it's a complete mess. Okay, so this basically means that what we think, we have marked them as separate notes, but these are actually not acoustically different, or there might be some note sharing that is going on. So BAT bat, CAT cat, whether they are replacing certain notes with certain others to make different meanings, we will have to compare notes from one call to the calls, notes of another call. And all of this work already has been done by Sonam. It is not published yet. We are in the process of publishing some of this work. And we know that there is a possibility there of some kind of combinatorial rules which are underlying this combination of notes to form phrases. There might be situations where certain different note types are being combined to produce a novel call, or even certain calls are combined, which is black and coffee being combined to. So black has a distinct meaning, coffee has a distinct meaning, and black plus coffee has a unique meaning, which is black coffee. So that also may be going on in the Jungle Babbler. What we know, it is more than just babble. This work has been published recently, and you can read about it online. I think it's available. So what is the take-home message from my talk? What I want to tell is that most of this work has been the result of collaboration between people. I have not published papers with just one student or with just one. There are papers, but not so many. Most of my work, or at least has required the collaboration between multiple individuals. And so science is really truly a collaborative process, and we need to seek out, we need to have a good network of peers with whom we can find possibilities of collaboration. And that is when we can ask more interesting questions, I believe. What I also want to emphasize is that there is a lot of interesting questions and model systems available in the backyards of our homes, right? There are many commonly available species which offer to be good model systems to ask a lot of interesting questions in ecology and evolution. And we don't really need to go to remote locations like a rainforest. I mean, I do not regret going to Kudremukh for my work, but the point being that you do not have to, ecological research does not have to be done in these remote locations, which are very inaccessible, a lot of bureaucratic problems to access these places. So much is available around you. So look out, observe the animals and the plants, organisms around you, and you will be able to find interesting questions based on your observations. With respect to acoustics, what I have to tell is that there is impressive structural complexity of vocalization in rather relatively small birds. And like the purple sunbird is being able to produce those suffixes which seem to have a complex vocal mechanism, it begs the questions to understand how exactly these calls are being produced, the anatomy behind this complex vocal mechanism, what sort of drives, and also, of course, what drives the evolution of such complex call. There is functional complexity, and in calls in some species where different calls make a different meaning, whereas in some other species, many different calls have the same meaning. And this functional complexity, when it exists, it sort of gives us a window to understand how information is being encoded. With respect to combinatorial rules or syntax, and of course, looking at signal evolution with respect to what really drives this enormous diversity of signals that we see, and what and how exactly can we test these hypotheses. So with that, I would end my talk by quoting Darwin, that there is endless forms, and there is grandeur in this view of life, where we are actually appreciating these endless forms. We need to observe these endless forms before we can ask our questions. So go out in the wild, observe your organism, whether these are plants or they're animals, or you are interested in something else. Please spend time in thinking. Much of your research actually is thinking. And only when you think about these questions, I think you will be able to address interesting interesting phenomena in the natural world. And if you are not in a very big hurry, which is often a problem in science. If you are in a hurry to publish, I'm extremely slow. So much so that my students, I'm sure, are extremely annoyed with me at how slow I am. But I think it has its own value. When you take your time to put pieces of the puzzle together, you get a better picture, a big picture. So this is IISER Mohali. In the back, you can maybe faintly see this Shivaliks. This is where most of this work has been carried out, except for the cricket work. In and around IISER Mohali, so we just go to our backyards and we look at the birds and the insects and we ask questions that interest us. This is an old picture of my lab. There are many new members and some of the older members have left to join other labs for their PhD. This is Anushka, my daughter. And thank you very much for your attention. I would like to thank all my students for all the interesting work that they have done, which I have been able to present. And much of the work that I have presented here, the slides were also made or at least helped by the students to present in front of you. So thank you very much. And of course to IISER Mohali for infrastructural support and various funding agencies to fund my research, but also to fund people in the lab who basically are fueling all of this. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Manjari. Thanks for this wonderful talk. Very, very nice, quite diverse, going from crickets to birds. I'll open up for questions. I think is someone else going to coordinate the question session now from the Science Council, or how do we do this?
Yes, ma'am, I can coordinate for the asking questions.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am, for a wonderful talk. It was really informative. We have a question in the chats, and I would ask them. Raghav is asking, why sparrows take bath in sand just before rain?
I don't know. Well, it could be, I don't know why just before rain, but mud bath in various animals has its adaptationist explanation that it helps them get rid of ectoparasites. But I don't know why sparrows do that and why they do that before rain.
Thank you, ma'am. If anyone has a question, they are please free to raise their hands and I will unmute them.
So I have a question actually, Manjari, sort of because you work across so many fields, and just sort of a general question on acoustics. How easy is it to go from crickets to birds to frogs and, like across taxa? Like how easy is it to look at an acoustic pattern and say, like you study crickets and you kind of go like, oh yeah, I can see the patterns and they may be similar? Or do you need really like a lot more introduction, to that group of animals before you get in? Because like, for instance, for plants, for me to move from one family to the other, it's kind of easy, but not really, like I still need to spend time to understand the plant family. And so we take time, and it's a slow process. Like what you said, it doesn't happen that fast for me. So I was just wondering, like, is it same with acoustic things across taxa?
Well, it took a very long time. It took a very, very long time for me to learn, and I'm sure for my students also to pick up. For instance, the babbler paper that I presented today, it was 4.5 years of fieldwork, and at the end of 4.5 years of fieldwork is where we reached. But to address your question, how to move between systems and whether it is easy, in case of understanding acoustics, it is not that difficult because the basics of acoustics, the fundamentals are the same. There might be certain features of the signals in certain taxonomic group which do not exist in some others, whereas some which are new. But basically, these are the fundamentals is still the same. There is the temporal structure, there is the spectral structure, and then there is sound intensity. There are only these three parameters. So how sound is distributed across time, how it is distributed across frequency, and the intensity of the sound or the loudness of the sound. These are the three parameters. Within each of these things, there will be specific parameters which some of which may not be relevant in some systems and may not even be present in some system. But otherwise it is not, if you ask me, it's not very difficult. Second thing, what I would like to say is the harder part is actually the biology of the animal, which takes a very long time. It took me a very, very long time to start working on birds, and yeah, it takes very long. The biology is much harder, and I think this is no surprise. The physics is easy.
You know, that's what I was about to say. I hope there are physics students here. I think RG has a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Manjari, this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm so glad I joined. Not only did I learn, but it's the inspiration value of your lecture. And I hope the students, I'm sure the students will see this. I mean, if I'm getting inspired, then the students will surely really get inspired. So I'm so glad I joined this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a dream which you may be able to realize very soon. So now you have mapped this structural complexity, functional complexity in the jungle babbler. Now, if you map along with this, the similar structural and functional complexity of another sympatric species. So it's like, you know, people talking to each other in Hindi and Kannada or English simultaneously, and there should be very little or no interference. Also, in terms of structural complexity, if you analyze different human languages, you get a very interesting phylogenetic tree of the structural complexity. Also functional complexity, but even more structural. So if you can overlap the whole system of at least two sympatric species speaking different languages, but each having structural complexity, functional complexity, that would sort of really make me say, this is language.
The short answer to your question is I haven't done it, but I would like to give you a longer answer. We are interested in this, and I do see at least one or two students of mine in the audience, and they can speak up if they feel like. When please feel free to. Where we have actually looked at, okay, so we have looked at two different things. One thing what we did was to look at a social bird and a solitary species. So the purple sunbird is a solitary species, but has an interesting structural complexity, but we think it does not have functional complexity, but we still don't know fully. And the jungle babbler is a social species, and it's again sympatric with the purple sunbird. Practically everywhere in India it is sympatric. And we see that it has structural complexity. It is less complex. It does not have as big a repertoire as a purple sunbird, but it's definitely functionally more complex. So to that effect, this is a like beginning, but certainly not quite where we need to get. But we also have started, sir, looking at other social babblers. And we are working on, so I see Gitika and I think Gaurav was there at some point, who's working on large gray babblers, and they're looking at, so these are like sort of congeneric species, and they're phylogenetically closer to each other than they are to other babbler species. And we are looking at their calls, both functional and structural complexity. But more importantly, what we have done, and this is Sonam's work, we have looked at communication across Kannada and Tamil. So we are looking at how, whether the jungle babblers can respond appropriately to the calls of sympatric species. So eavesdropping, we are looking at eavesdropping between sympatric species, but we are also looking at eavesdropping in these species under allopatric conditions. So what happens when, you know, you are not in the same region? So yes, we are looking at it, but it's a long way to go still.
Wonderful. I can't wait to see. You are inside the gold mine and you have started digging. So I'm sure a great deal will come out. Fantastic. Great. Good luck to you and all your students.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
You can also write to me if you do not want to, or you cannot immediately think of something and it comes to you later. maybe Vinita, you can share my email ID and I'll be very happy to hear from any of you. And in better times, all of you are welcome to IISER Mohali. Please do come, and in your spare time, please do observe the babblers. They're all there around you. So,
and hopefully we'll get Manjari to IISER Bhopal once we are more open about traveling and having visitors, and it will be really nice to actually do a field work on campus. So we're starting actually. In fact, we're probably banding a few birds, the sparrows on campus in 2 weeks from now. So yeah, hopefully then, yeah, by the time you come,
we have absolutely no sparrows on campus. In fact,
no?
Not even a single one. I mean, none of the sparrows, none of the species, but house sparrow, absolutely not. We also did not have house crow till about a couple of years ago. And the crow only showed up. So it used to be a lot of fun for me to ask the students when they would come for the class where we would teach them, some birding. So which birds did you see on campus? They would be in the second year and we would ask, which birds have you seen on campus? And they would say pigeon, myna, crow, sparrow. And we would know it would be funny because crow and sparrow were not there. I mean, it's still not there. And at the end of that semester, Vinita, they would have a list of at least 30 to 40 species. And the longest list we have got is 60 plus in a semester. Oh, wow. So that is how they learn, and they learn so quickly. So I think there's a lot of a great value in just making observations and pushing them outdoors. I think Corona should help. We should have more classrooms outside.
Yeah, I know. I think, yeah, so we have an active biology club, right? I think the Science Council may know more about it.
Yes, ma'am. We have an active biology club. And regarding the birding thing, we had a birding event this morning only, where a few enthusiasts from our college went to the hillside and around the campus and make a documentary on the list of birds that were available on the campus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there is a question.
There's another question, yeah.
How would these observations differ if bird call mimic was studied, say a black drongo? So mimicry, we think we understand the function of mimicry, but at least I do not understand it fully. Mimicking species have various different, so one of the hypothesis that explains the evolution of mimicry is basically having large repertoire. So you mimic, you hear the birds that are around you and even sounds that are around you simply to increase your vocal repertoire, as in the case of the lyrebird and the famous example. All of you must have seen that David Attenborough video. And now the recent video in where the lyrebird is copying a crying baby in the zoo. So one of the function of mimicry would be to increase the repertoire size. But just because it's mimicking the calls of another species, that does not mean it is driven by that. So the approach will be very different. And for instance, there are birds that can mimic the calls of the alarm calls of some species, causing individuals. So they basically hunt in mixed species flocks. They forage in mixed species flock. And I'm talking about, again, one species of drongo only, racket-tailed drongo. Eben Goodale worked on the racket-tailed drongo that is found in Sri Lanka and did absolutely fantastic, phenomenal foundational work on this, where he showed basically the function of mimicry here, where kleptoparasitism, which is where they produce the call of the alarm calls of some species or mimic the calls of a predator, which causes group members to drop the food that they have collected. And then the racket-tailed drongo swoops in and picks up the food. So in that case, mimicry is driven by a completely different reason. So the answer to your question is yes, mimicking species are much, much harder, and therefore you have to be very careful when you choose your model species. You must know the biology of the species before you choose it. If I would have picked up a mimicking species, I would have been in big trouble. 4 years down the line, I would be in big trouble. That is for sure.
Thank you,
Anyone
ma'am.
else? Any curiosity questions? Anything else?
Ma'am,
Okay.
I might have a little question. I am not from biology background actually, but this question might sound silly. But I had a question that as a humans, when we listen to the voices of other humans, we are able to recognize that, yeah, this is my mom, this is my dad. So is this the same way in animals as well? Like, are they able to recognize who is talking?
In fact, it's not a silly question. It is one of the objectives of our research. One is to individual recognition of individuals based on calls. So basically, if you hear the call of familiar individuals, you may be able to learn the individual differences, and thereby it may be possible it is possible for us humans, but for animals it is possible, and it has been shown in some species that it is possible that they can recognize kin based on acoustic features. But even something more simple things like, can they tell whether they are which age class, for instance, whether it's a baby or is it, when we hear the sound, we can definitely tell whether it's a baby or it's an adult or it's an old person. We can definitely tell whether it's a male and whether it's a female. So can animals do that? That is in babblers, this is certainly one of the questions that I'm interested in, and in some species it is possible. So yeah, it's not a silly question. It's a very important, it's a very active field of research. Individual recognition, kin recognition through acoustic vocal signatures, especially non-human primates.
I think language in itself is such a big, I mean, it's such a fast evolving thing, right? Like, for instance, the entire fact that now we can talk in smileys, right? We've forgotten how to write, right? And the fact that, like, in my lifetime, I've gone through English changing so much, right? From how we sort of wrote it in this classic. So it started with like us having Shakespeare in English. Then it was the, more like, communicative kind of English, and then shorthand English, and now it's like smileys, and so it's like it has changed so much, and the information content remains the same.
Yeah, but again,
the language has changed. So it's like, for me, it's like fascinating how, it's just
part of it is like, of course, evolution, which could be cultural. So it is just transferred by learning and from generation to generation. And the other aspect would be something which is more primordial, and I think that is where my interests lie quite there. This is going to change very drastically, so that's why, I mean, learning, for instance, even in birds, we are trying to understand whether eavesdropping, for instance, in birds has been proposed as a learned a form of learning, where they learn the calls of sympatric species, and they learn to respond to that. For instance, alarm calls of langurs alarm calls of sambar deer, to which langurs may respond, so on and so forth. But that is learning. But we are trying to understand, and we are trying to look at, using the babbler, social babblers, whether it can actually be innate. So that would be very interesting, because if you know already that this call of this species means this, that without learning, and that you can test when you are checking this thing in allopatry, which is what Sonam has done. And we have evidence that they can respond appropriately in allopatry. So this means that eavesdropping need not necessarily be driven by learning. I'm going to get bashed for this paper whenever we put this out, for sure. I'll get a lot of brickbats and 1,000 rejections, but yeah, that's how it's going to be.
But that's okay. That just means that, I mean, that there are two ways of looking at it, isn't it? I mean, it's kind of nice to not be in the mainstream thought process as well, right? So there's one more question that just came up, I think, no? Why Jacobin don't drink stagnant or flowing water? Is it more susceptible to pathogens or any other reason?
That is more mythological, na? Ki it only drinks the water of the rain. I mean, I don't think it is quite true. But it does. The Jacobin cuckoo has a very interesting relationship with monsoon, by the way. You know that these actually come in from Africa, and they ride the monsoon winds. So that is why, that is the relationship. So they use the monsoon wind for their migration into India. And then again, the retreating monsoon, they return. So their timing of arrival is exactly matched with monsoon, simply because of this ease of travel. And I don't think it is because they want fresh water, but more so for travel purposes. But also these, since you asked about Jacobin cuckoo, I will say that there would be no Jacobin cuckoo if there were no jungle babblers, because jungle babblers are one of the primary hosts of Jacobin cuckoo who are brood parasites. So we are also looking at acoustic communication between host and a brood parasite.
Should we wind up here?
Yeah, you can always write to me on email or something.
Arihant, all right, so I guess if there are no more questions, I'll take this opportunity again to thank Manjari for a fantastic talk. And I think this is probably the first talk on acoustics, if I'm not mistaken, in IISER Bhopal. So yeah, and so in that sense also, it's really nice to have you finally give a talk. I really wish it was more in person than online, but I hope we can get you here again. And I'm also very, very glad that Professor Gadekar could come and join us and be part of our Singularity. And maybe we'll get you next time for Singularity as well. To hear the B talk, but we've heard, I think, I'm not so sure if this batch has heard, but the previous batches have heard Professor Gadekar give a fantastic talk at IISER. So with this, thanks Manjari, and I hope we'll have students who'll visit Mohali. All of you are, I think we have very nice internship programs, so please do consider going between institutes, and if there are Mohali students, please consider coming to Bhopal to learn our birds and look at our crickets and everything that's moving. All right. With this, I thank the organizers as well. Singularity, I think this program doesn't end here, but you are one of our last star speakers, the star 4 speaker. And so it's really nice to end it in this very high note. And I think the students have other programs that will follow, which are cultural, and I think they have the prize distributions, etc. So I will leave the students to continue with it, and I will stop here. Thanks again, Manjari, and thanks again,
Professor Nita. Thanks to the students. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.
So we log out here. Is that okay, Arihant?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
So now we would proceed with the prize distribution ceremony. Kavya, the event manager, I would request her to come up and take over the stage from now.
Hello, so I am Kavya. I am event manager of Singularity 2021. So yeah, I would like to announce now the winners of each event. So first, we'll go with Treasure Hunt. So the second runner-up of Treasure Hunt is from a team from IISER Bhopal. It's Richard David, Bikshita Das, Vaibhav Mishra, and Sachi Gaikad. Now, for first runner-up is a team from IISER Tirupati, Sabhyadini, KB, Vikanta Shashank, Madhumita Krishnaswamy, Harini Suresh, and Aditya Panighe. Now, the winner of Treasure Hunt is also from IISER Tirupati. It is Bhavyadini, Suman Sahu, Amisha Baiju. I hope you guys can hear me.
Yes, Kavya, you are audible.
Okay. So, I guess Treasure Hunt is all winners are done. So now we'll move on to Looking Glass. So for second runner-up from Looking Glass is from IISER Bhopal. He is Raj Mishra. First runner-up of Looking Glass is from IIT Kanpur, Himanshu Jindal. And the winner of Looking Glass is also from IISER Bhopal. He is Abhinav Sethi. Now moving on to next event, that is Clarion. So the first runner-up for Clarion is Atharv Ambekar, Shubham Das, Ishika Ram from IISER Bhopal. And the winner for Clarion is Sahil Vad, Satyan Mandal, Nakshatra Goswami from IISER Bhopal. Now, for moving on to next event, that is Badder Talk. So, for Badder Talk, we have the one and only winner, that is from Delhi Public School, Nilbad Bhopal, and he's a school student and he done very well, and his name is Advatit Santosh. Now, moving on to our next event, that is Hunting the Heavens. For second runner-up for Hunting the Heavens is from IISER Bhopal, that is Riya Rai, Spandan Sharma, and Raghav Galgali. For first runner-up, a team from IIT Kanpur, Varun Murlidharan, Gaurav Manwani, Harish Adusule. For winner of Hunting the Heavens, there are two people. One is from Manipal Institute of Technology and second is from IIT Kanpur. They are Brinda for Manipal Institute of Technology and Varshita from IIT Kanpur. Now, moving on to our next event, that is Quirky Quills. So, the second runner-up for Quirky Quills is from Nizer, and he is Surat Sahu. The first runner-up for Quirky Quills is from IISER Thiruvananthapuram, Anutha Sunil. Now, the winner of Quirky Quills is from University of Delhi, and it is Sumedha Sengupta. Now moving on to our next event, a very trending event, that is Crypto Roulette. First runner-up for Crypto Roulette is Anushk Naval from IISER Bhopal. And the winner of Crypto Roulette is Manav Kundal from IISER Bhopal. Now our the best quiz of the year and the most amazing quiz is our Singularity quiz, and the winner of Singularity quiz, the second runner-up is from Singularity quiz is from IISER Bhopal, and they are Damanjeet Singh, Danal Singh, and Dipanshu Shetal. The first runner-up is also from IISER Bhopal, and they are Ranjan Bassi, Priyanshu Kumar Rai, and Soham Ranade. The winner of Singularity quiz team is from IISER Bhopal. They are Padmanav Baruha and Agastya. Also Suthant Srinivasan. Now moving on to our next event, that is Pictionary. So second runner-up for Pictionary is Raj Mishra and Sahil Vad, and they are from IISER Bhopal. The first runner-up for Pictionary is Riddhiman Sharma from IISER Bhopal. And the winner of Pictionary is Abhinav Sethi from IISER Bhopal. Now with our next event, that is What's Wrong with the Scene. The second runner-up for What's Wrong with the Scene is from IISER Bhopal, Om Singh Vashisht. The first runner-up for What's Wrong with the Scene is from IISER Bhopal, Raj Mishra. And the winner is also from IISER Bhopal, Jaidev Singh Rao. So here are all the events. There are a few more events which are still undecided, and they are gonna announce their results soon, as soon as they end. So we'll announce it by then. Thank you, and congratulations to all the winners for giving their excellent performance in all the events and making this fair successful.
Thank you, Kavya, for introducing the winners. We hope you all enjoyed the Singularity. Thank you all for attending it. It was a wonderful experience for us, and we hope it was the same for you. A 7-day long event of science and culture. We will be having a cultural night program on Instagram. We'll be posting some entries. Please look out for them on the Singularity page. And thank you everyone for joining. Hope you all enjoyed Singularity 2022.